Immunology, Chapter 2 Cells and Organs of the Immune System. In this lecture, we will repeat briefly what was mentioned in our first lecture. We will discuss the concept of hematopoiesis, where immune cells come from, the primary lymphoid organs and the secondary lymphoid organs. We will talk about, again, cells of the innate and adaptive immune system, how lymph circulates through the immune system. We will talk about the interaction between immune cells and our organs, the clinical relevance of immune cells, and end with a summary. So the immune system relies on specialized cells and organs to detect and respond to pathogens effectively. So we have cells. These are produced from hematopoietic stem cells in our bone marrow. Immune cells are divided into innate and adaptive types. So you should remember from our previous lecture, we said innate was macrophages and neutrophils. The adaptive, we talk about T and B cells. Then we have the organs, of course. These serve as sites for immune cell production, maturation, and activation. For example, in the bone marrow, we have immune cell production. In the thymus, we have the maturation of our T cells. Now let's begin at the very beginning. So we have hematopoiesis. It is the process of blood cell production in the bone marrow. And keep in mind here, this is the same chart that was included in the introductory lesson. And it is worth studying, especially when we move along into courses and lectures in oncology, for example. And we study subjects like chronic myeloid leukemia or acute lymphoid leukemia, etc., etc. It is directly linked to different cells in this tree. Now, when we talk about hematopoiesis, we have two key lineages. We have the myeloid lineage, which gives rise to the innate cells we've mentioned, like the neutrophils and macrophages, and the dendritic cells. And if you remember, the dendritic cells were the antigen-presenting cells mentioned in the previous lecture. We also have the lymphoid lineage, seen here, right? Now here we see the production of adaptive cells like the T cells, the B cells, and also our natural killer cells. It should also make sense now when you hear the word T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes. We call them T cells and B cells, but they come from the lymphoid progenitor cell. So they are lymphocytes. Now, I would recommend stopping and taking notes to learn this pathway, learn the different cells, but we will repeat it and we will talk about each of these over time in our courses in great detail. So there is no need to memorize. It is actually not recommended at all to memorize if you can keep in mind the fact that it all starts at the bone marrow. And we have different lineages. If you've picked up on that, that's sufficient for now. Over time, you will learn why it is actually rather important knowing which tree the different cells we talk about branch from. And furthermore, the different stages from a progenitor red blood cell all the way to a mature erythrocyte, because there are several steps in between here that are not covered in this map. When we go to hematology, for example, or during this course, you will see some examples of the different steps between these. But for now, try to get an idea, and if you can remember to pinpoint the myeloid lineage to the innate cells, primarily the neutrophils and macrophages, because we will talk about them a lot, and of course the lymphoid tree to T cells and B cells. So the primary lymphoid organs include the bone marrow, this is the origin of all immune cells. It is also, and this is quite important, it is also the site of B cell development and maturation. So we said all immune cells come from the bone marrow. But we already mentioned before that uniquely the T cells, right? The T cells are immature from in the bone marrow, and then they actually travel to our thymus. And in the thymus, they mature. The B cells, however, do not. They do not travel elsewhere. They are produced in the bone marrow and they undergo maturation in the bone marrow. So that's a key differentiation between the two. So in the thymus, this is where T cells mature. And this is very active in childhood and it shrinks with age, called thymic involution. And when we say maturation, you can also think of it like education. So all the cells, immune cells, are born in the bone marrow, but in the thymus, the T cells go to school. And it's quite a good choice of word because they do learn through several processes to mature. And the idea is for this T cell to learn, for example, what to attack, what to target, but more importantly, what not to target. And it is here we plant the seed for what is a part of what is to come, meaning once you've learned immunology, you need to study autoimmunity. So now we're learning the basics of our fundamental cells, our organs involved in identifying pathogens when everything is functional as it's supposed to. We have the innate system recognizing a bacteria, presenting the antigen for our adaptive immune system to come, coordinate a response, our B cells to produce antibodies and so-called memory cells for next time, etc. All that is fine. But what if our immune cells, our T cells, for example, are attacking the self, so to say, our own tissues that are not harmful at all? This is where autoimmunity begins. So that's a little side note for later. Then we have the secondary lymphoid organs. So these are sites where immune cells encounter pathogens and become activated. So for example, we have lymph nodes. These filter lymph and present antigen to T and B cells. We have the spleen, which filters blood, removes old blood cells, and responds to blood-borne pathogens. And then we have the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. This defends mucosal surfaces like in our gut, our respiratory tract, and urogenital system. And here you have an anatomic picture of, or illustration of a lymph node. And you can see where in this lymph node you will mostly see different types of cells. So for example, here in the primary lymphoid follicle, you will find mostly B cells. In the paracortical areas, seen here, you will find mostly T cells. And we have the medullary cords, seen here. Macrophages and plasma cells are rich here. We have blood vessels, of course, bringing blood to the lymph node and draining it through our veins. We have the efferent lymphatic vessel. Now, you could definitely pause for a moment here and take notes, because it is worth knowing the structure of the lymph node. Now, we've mentioned cells of the innate immune system, but it's worth repeating. Also to clarify a point of confusion. But before we do that, let's start with neutrophils. So these are the first responders, and they engulf pathogens. Then we have macrophages. Then we have the macrophages. These clean up pathogens and dead cells, and they also present antigen to T cells. We also call these antigen-presenting cells. This is super important when we talk about the coordination and interplay between our innate system and our adaptive system. This is where the antigen-presenting cells come to play. We also have the dendritic cells that capture antigens and present them to T cells. So again, linking our innate and adaptive immunity. Now we also have natural killer cells. These destroy mainly virus-infected and abnormal cells. They are also part of the innate immune system, and this is the point of clarification. Because if you remember the map of hematopoiesis, the origin of blood cells, you remember perhaps that natural killer cells came from the lymphoid progenitor cells. Together with T cells and B cells, we also had natural killer cells. And it is sometimes a point of confusion linking natural killer cells to our adaptive immune system, thinking that they all come from the lymphoid tree, meaning that they are all part of the adaptive immune system. But no, natural killer cells belong to our innate immune system. Only its lineage is indeed lymphoid. Furthermore, from the myeloid lineage, we have eosinophils and basophils, and these are mainly involved in allergic reactions and parasitic infections. Now, what about the cells of the adaptive immune system? As mentioned, we have the T cells, and they are divided into helper T cells, also noted as CD4+. These orchestrate immune responses by activating other cells. And we have cytotoxic T cells, written out as CD8+. These kill infected or cancerous cells. Furthermore, in our adaptive system, we have our B cells. These are involved in producing antibodies to then neutralize pathogens. And these B cells transform into plasma cells for antibody production. We also have then memory cells. These provide long-term immunity after an infection. Now, we have an illustration here, but I don't want you to get too caught up on this right now, as we will return to it later. The idea is to illustrate, and it could have been expanded upon by showing that a neutrophil or a macrophage breaks down a bacteria or an invading pathogen, and then the macrophage, which is an antigen-presenting cell, presents this. We then have T cells circulating, finding it, and then communicating with our B cell. And they communicate via different receptors. And we call the receptors where these antigens will be presented, or where they will be shown, etc., things like TCR, or major histocompatibility complex, MHC. We have MHC1, MHC2. We will talk about it as we move along in this course, so there is nothing to memorize here. It's just to get an initial idea that these terms will be revisited later. Now, how lymph circulates through the immune system. So the lymphatic system has two crucial roles. First, it drains extracellular fluid and filters pathogen through lymph nodes. So we have, when we talk about, for example, blood volume, we have intracellular fluid and we have extracellular fluid. Now, without going into depths here, because we have discussed this elsewhere, when there is pressure changes in our circulatory system, perhaps you know that fluid will move into extracellular spaces. And if it's overwhelmed, we have the lymphatic drainage system also helping alleviating this extra fluid. So you can already then pick up on the intrinsic interplay between our cardiovascular system, our arteries, our veins, and our lymphatic system. Furthermore, another role is to transport immune cells to infection sites. Now, lymph carries antigens to lymph nodes where T and B cells are activated. If you remember the previous slides, we showed an illustration of the lymph node looking a bit like a kidney. And we said that some areas are rich in B cells, some in T cells, etc. So the lymph, or lymphatic vessel system, carries antigens to these lymph nodes where B and T cells are activated and where they can destroy the pathogen. Then we have the interaction between the immune cells and our organs again. So we just mentioned the coordinated response of it all. So immune cells interact in lymph nodes, spleen, and tissues to generate a response. We also talked about antigen presentation. So dendritic cells present antigens to T cells, which then in turn activate B cells for antibody production. So you're starting to see parts of our innate system with the middleman, the T cell, gets the adaptive immune cell, B cell, to produce antibodies. And these antibodies will be a subject of great detailed study as we move along, then attack the pathogens it has been produced for. This is what we call the memory part of our immune system. These antibodies are specifically, have very specific characteristics targeting very specific antigens. So in the future, when that same pathogen that entered our body this time, when it enters again with the same antigen, we have massive antibodies available to immediately attack it. So our immune system in this way adapts, learns, remembers, and overproduces antibodies ready to attack the same invader if it happens again. Now, what is the clinical relevance of immune cells in our organs? Well, perhaps it is rather obvious right now, following from our previous slides. We talked about the bone marrow being the place where all blood and immune cells are produced. So disorders like, for example, leukemia disrupts this process. And therefore, if you have a breakdown of immune cell production, let's say, you will end up with immune deficiency and therefore increased infection risks. Another one is thymic disorder. So we talked about the thymus, where the T cell goes for maturation. And in, for example, DiGeorge syndrome, which is a congenital absence or underdevelopment of the thymus, will lead to, of course, a decrease or reduced T cell function, making these patients vulnerable to viral and fungal infections. Another important part is lymph nodes. So if you have lymph node swelling, we talked about lymph nodes filtering pathogens and where immune responses are activated. So what they do is commonly swell during bacterial or viral infections, for example, strep throat or mononucleosis due to immune cell activation. So for example, during strep throat, the anterior cervical lymph nodes, especially those located along the front of the neck, near the jaw, and under the chin, they are most commonly swollen and tender. You have perhaps yourself experienced an episode like that. So these nodes, these lymph nodes that are placed in the anterior cervical lymph nodes, they drain the pharynx and tonsils. And these are the primary sites of infection in, for example, streptococcal pharyngitis. So swelling here is a classic clinical sign supporting the diagnosis. And then, of course, we talked about the spleen. So having undergone a splenectomy would lead to increased risk of infections due to loss of blood filtration. So the spleen helps remove old blood cells and fight certain bacteria. After a splenectomy, meaning a surgical removal of the spleen, patients are at a higher risk for severe infections, especially from encapsulated bacteria like Streptococcus pneumoniae. So in summary then, the immune system relies on cells like neutrophils, macrophages, T cells, and B cells, which all originate from the bone marrow. Primary organs include the bone marrow and thymus, and this is where immune cells are produced and undergo development and maturation in the thymus when we're talking about the T cell. Then we have the secondary organs like our lymph nodes, spleen, MALT, and this is where immune responses are activated. And that's the end of chapter 2. Go on to chapter number 3.